Astra, thank you so much for joining me for this chat. And I am really, really excited to talk about this because I am just very, very curious. That's the point of it. So would you like to introduce yourself for my audience?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Nisha. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you. My name's Astra. I'm a Solomonic ceremonial magician who focuses in the grimoire tradition. And I'm actually here because I'm also Catholic, in addition to practicing magic. So that's a brief introduction for who I am. And if you need to find me places, I'm on Instagram. I'm most active on Discord. Like that'll be the easiest way to get a hold of me. But yeah, I'm kind of in a lot of the witchy communities, so there's a good chance you'll find me somewhere.
Yeah, I do not doubt that. Like, yeah, you have test tubes and Cauldron, the podcast, which I think is the only thing that there is at the intersection of science and witchcraft. Because I
Mhm.
understand people might think those things don't go together, but it's very fascinating when they do.
Yeah, yeah. So the Test Tubes and Cauldron podcast, it's all about kind of the intersection of science and spirituality. And the reason why I started it, and I have two co-hosts, both Han and Fel, who are wonderful in their own rights. But I initially started it because I was really irritated as like a scientist myself by people's misapplication of the science to try and prove the spiritual. And there's always been connection between science and spirituality, especially if you think back to like alchemy,
Hmm.
and even the intersection of like religion, science, and magic all together. And so it's always existed. But I think a lot of times in modern day, people try and force it more than it should be. Or we take things like the double slit experiment, for example, and we say, oh, this proves magic, when realistically it actually doesn't. Because if you talk to any kind of physicist, they'll actually like give you what it really is saying. And so I was seeing a lot of that discourse in the community, and I was like, I kind of just want to put this to rest a little bit. Like I'm a scientist myself. Hannah's also a scientist, and then Fel has background in science as well. Although Fel is like very much our history expert on the show. And so that's kind of how that came to be, and it's been going. And we've actually just recorded new episodes, and we're starting the seasons back up. So hopefully that'll be coming out fairly soon.
Awesome. I am partial because my spouse is very scientifically minded as well, and something that can never stand. And at the beginning, they were just like indulging me more than anything. Was literally that they were like, if I hear one more witch talking about quantum, I'm gonna have
Yes.
issues here. So I really, really find that test tube and cauldrons really fit that space that otherwise was empty, and I'm really, really grateful for it. And
Oh
that's
yeah,
how I
thank you.
started being a fan, basically.
You're very sweet. I'm glad it's been helpful. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of people who have reached out over the couple of years that it's been up and have said, we really appreciate it, and that's always good to know. Like, I never want to do anything. I mean, it's just a podcast we put up because we want to share that information with people. To know that it helps is like really gratifying, um, in a lot of senses. So.
And it's truly, truly marvelous and valuable for everybody of us that is curious about. Can I just have one receipt? Well, something that looks like a receipt or a quote or a bibliography. That's really nice. It's a really good. It's neat.
Yeah.
Right. Let's get into the questions then, because you mentioned briefly like you are a practicing Catholic, and
Mhm.
from what I understand, you weren't like born and baptized. You chose in adult life to be a Catholic.
Yeah,
Um,
so I was actually born Protestant. I was an evangelical Christian for much of my early life. And I left the faith when I was around probably like in my, junior year of high school. And then I went to college and I was still very much, it was so funny. I remember going off to college. My mom very much was like, don't lose your faith. And I was like, little do you know, I've lost it already. And so I kind of went into college with this very atheist kind of perspective for a while, but the atheism never really worked for me just because I couldn't, like, as somebody who studies the natural world, I really couldn't consider like that it just came out of nothing. Like it didn't work for me. And so I was like, okay, well, that's fine. I'll just become agnostic. And so I was an agnostic for many years before I was like, hey, this witchcraft thing sounds kind of cool. And so I began looking into that as well. So kind of like through university and then kind of into grad school is where, well, mostly university, where I went from agnostic to pagan. And I was an eclectic witch for a good number of years, like a solid 2 or 3-ish years. before I found ceremonial magic through a friend of mine. And they were like, we think you'd like this. And I was like, oh, but I'd heard all the stuff that we hear about ceremonial magic, right? It's people who are really crappy and there's all these orders and nothing good comes from it and it's really complicated and all these things. They were like, I really think if you just tried it, you would enjoy it. So I did. And here we are years later. I'm a staunch ceremonial magician. I'm all in favor for the grimoire tradition. And then about 2 years ago, well, I should back up a bit. Around 3 years ago, I visited the cathedral in Cologne, Germany. I was there on a trip with my family. And I had been kind of looking into Catholicism for about 2 years prior to that. And I remember just like having a moment where I asked God and I was like, listen, I am already kind of believing right again in God. Like, if the ceremonial magic tradition has this like weird pipeline of like back to Christianity. But I really feel called to become Catholic, and I would like to have some kind of confirmation that this is the right thing to do. And the reason why I wanted that was because my family is Protestant, right? Like, becoming Catholic to them is like an absolute no. We don't do that. Very much like I grew up around anti-Catholic sentiments. Like, there was all of these things that like really made the idea of becoming Catholic kind of scary. But I really felt called to do so. And so I had a moment in the cathedral where I just very much felt like the quiet, resonating, yes, like this is what you're supposed to be doing. And so it took me a year before I listened. And I remember reaching out to one of my priests at my local parish, and I was like, hey, I want to start RCIA. Like, when can I do this? And it was so funny because I reached out in like March or something, right after, a new group of people is confirmed at Easter usually. And he was like, well, we've already started. And like, technically we weren't going to start a new one until, September. But, praise God, there were enough of us who wanted to become Catholic. Like, he started a separate class for like me and all these other people. And then we got confirmed in August. So it was one of those things, right, where like the journey itself to become Catholic has been like riddled in its own difficulty. But it's really one of the best things I think I could have decided to do. And it's been really interesting to see how the intersection of like Catholicism and my practice has only grown. And my practice has become stronger because of it. So I'm forever grateful for that single moment in Cologne where my life kind of just totally changed.
That is absolutely fascinating because, for the record, because I was born and raised in Italy, I was just born in Catholicism, like most people
Yeah.
in Italy are. So something that always impressed me was that the stuff you know and the stuff you do, possibly because you've chosen it in adult life, is so much more. You know so much more about religion, despite the fact that I was raised weekly in it, going to mass and everything for the first like 2 decades of my life. So that is truly fascinating to me. So, but well, you sort of said how you define yourself in terms of religion, but then about magical practice, like basically what came first, Catholicism or your practice? I seem to understand your practice then came first.
Yeah, the practice is what came first. So I began magic with I started getting into ceremonial magic through kind of planetary magic. That was my gateway, as it is for most people.
It is again.
And
I feel you.
yes, it really is kind of the easiest start to get into everything. And so it slowly began incorporating planetary magic into my, at the time, eclectic practice. And then I was reading a bunch of stuff about ceremonial magic. And I found like Israel Regardie's Big Black Book. I found some teachings of the Golden Dawn. I found teachings of Crowley from the Lima. And I began reading those too. And I remember I also was looking into grimoires at the time. And of course, the one that everybody knows and the one that everybody gets told to work, which is absurd in my opinion, but is the Lesser Key of Solomon, right? Like that is the one, which is, people are more familiar with the term the Goetia. So I came across the Lesser Key of Solomon as well. And I was like, oh, this is kind of what everybody says you should start with. And so I was like, I guess I start with this. Like, I don't know. But I, unlike many people, was like, I want to do this right. Because if you read the key, there's the lesser key and the greater key. And the greater
Yeah.
key of Solomon has a whole list of things that, you're supposed to do in preparation before you work the lesser key. And So I said to myself, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make all the tools. I'm going to do the timings correctly. I'm going to get the robes. I'm going to embroider them. Like I'm going to do all the consecrations. And I'm going to do it the right way. At the time, and like this, I think comes from a very scientific mindset where it's like, if you have a protocol, you follow the protocol. Like, why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
It's not going to work if you don't follow the protocol.
I know, right? Feel you.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I was like, I'm really going to follow the protocol that's laid out in the grimoire in order to do it right. So it took me probably a year and a half roughly to kind of get everything together. And during that time, I, thought to myself, hey, well, at this time, like, why don't I also kind of work through the Golden Dawn? Like, it is a tradition. And the Big Black Book essentially has all of like the lessons and stuff that they would teach you if you were initiating. And so I began working through that. And I was like teaching myself how to scry during that period as well. And so I built a lot of skills as a magician. Like this was during the time when I was doing the LBRP twice a day. I was doing, all the invoking rituals, the pentagram and the hexagram and all of this stuff, to really try and like build my skills as a magician before I had this huge ritual. And, I did my first goetic ritual. Honestly, it was like not super encouraging. But I was like, that's fine. Like, let me reach out to some people and just like, because at this time I was getting more connected. And I was like, let me reach out to people, talk to individuals, see what they've done. And, I got some input and then I tried another one and the second one worked better, which was good. But then I like backtracked a little bit and I began like looking through other grimoires and then testing different systems. So I worked through other parts of the Lemegaton, which is the collection of like 5 grimoires that are often kind of considered like the prime ones in Solomonic magic. So that was like the Ars Paulina, the Ars Notoria, the Ars Almodel. And specifically I went back to the Ars Almodel and I began working that one because I was like, it's already in the system that I use, so I might as well. A lot of the things cross over. So I worked the Ars Almodel and I really fell in love with that. And then I began working with the Pentacles of the Greater Key. Mm-hmm. And this is really where like my love of Solomonic magic blossomed. Was working with the angels of those pentacles. And to this day, they're still like my primary spirits. And then at that time, I found a grimoire card called the Arbitel. Now, the Arbitel is really like a very underrated grimoire in the magical space. And it works with the Olympic spirits, not the Olympic gods, but the Olympic spirits. And unlike Solomonic magic, it's very simple. The Arbitel's instructions are to essentially live a pious life. And all you have to do when you conjure them is pretty much pray them. Like, be holy, live a pious life, and then you just pray, and they should come. And I remember reading some more established magicians at the time, like their blogs on, their interactions with the Olympic spirits, and they included all these things from the Golden Dawn, like you do the LBRP and you do the Kabbalistic cross beforehand, and like all these other things. And I will never forget the first time I tried to conjure Fool, who is the Olympic spirit of the moon. I incorporated all these things because other magicians had done it beforehand and allegedly had success. So like, why would I change it? And he very much told me, like, you don't need to do this. Just like, stop. Don't include all of this. Just call me. And so I essentially closed down that ritual and then I called him up another time. And that was the beginning of my relationship with the Olympic spirits. And they have really become like more even than the angels of the pentacles. Like the Olympic spirits are kind of my ride or die aspects of my spirit team, and the familiars that they've given me over the years. And so that has kind of really that, and then the Solomonic pentacles, the angels of the pentacles of the Greater Key. My goodness, they're kind of my two like primary spirit teams. Although I've messed with many grimoires over the years and tried different things, so. That's the practice came first, but in working with those spirits, right? I don't know. I quickly came to realize that, I did think there was a God. These spirits were always about praising God. They never asked for worship themselves. And that was something that was contrary to what I often heard in the witchcraft community, which was the spirits wanted to be worshipped, or they wanted public recognition, or they wanted, offerings and stuff. And that was never really the case with these spirits. I mean, the furthest I would go with offerings for the spirits of the key, for example, is incense of the planetary nature, right? And so it was just very contrary. And over time, I quickly realized, like, they are, and in conversation with them too, they're worshiping something. Like, and they had multiple names for it, but to me it became pretty obvious that it was this creator, and I really couldn't help but just feel, because at this time, right, I had also been investigating Catholicism, so it all kind of rolled nicely into one. But I really couldn't help but feel that it was God that was kind of the arbiter of everything that was happening. Not to be like rude to people, but when people say things like, I worship the angels, the archangels, I often find that they're not actually dealing with the archangels. Because if anybody who's ever worked with, Archangel Michael or Uriel or Anael or whatever, whoever you called, they don't want worship. And they're pretty adamant about that. They always have been with me. Like, you don't worship me, we worship God.
I need to
Right?
ask this because you mentioned it before with the Olympic spirit of the moon, and now you mentioned it again. So I was like, okay, now I had this curiosity. How did they tell you? How did you get the information of, no, don't worry, you don't need to do all of this for me, like just call me for the Olympic spirit of the moon, and for them to say, no, 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 don't worship us, we worship God. Like, did you get that through divination? Did you get through that, like, in which, like, going to the practical level of things, because that's really fascinating for me. How did you have this kind of exchange to understand?
Yeah. So
Don't
it,
worry
it
about that.
depends on like how you call them, right? So the Olympic spirits, I usually engage with them and get communication both through dreams and scrying, mostly are kind of the two primary methods. So with the Olympic spirits, I conjure them usually in context of the drawing spirits into crystals system that was proposed by Tritemius. And that's been really useful because to me it's really helpful to have something to focus on and to like have this visual. I'm a very visual person. I'm learn
Same.
visually, like that's my thing. And so oftentimes it comes through images. And I've had some things with this with the Angels of the Key as well. But with them, it tends to be a little bit more auditory, or just like images in like the head, right? Where you kind of like
Yes.
see what they're sort of
Gotcha.
telling you. And I distinctly remember when I was engaging with the Pentacles of the Key, and they essentially said like, "Don't worship me, we worship God." It was the image of like my altar space transitioning to like, I don't even know how to explain this very well. To all of the angels essentially in heaven worshiping at the throne of God. So there was this massive light like at the very
Okay.
top, and I just saw angels everywhere. And
Wow.
everybody was like, there was music that I wasn't playing. I wasn't playing the music. There was no music in my room, but I heard music, and that imagery was like very much the no, 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 no. We don't worship you. Don't worship me. We worship God, right? And yeah, with Fool and the Olympic Spirits, it's often very scrying, or I get a lot of information from them in dreams. So something that I think people expect when they do ritual is they want a response in the moment, but like the spirits don't always come. But even though they don't necessarily come, they can still hear you. And so something I've taken to doing in a lot of my magic is, I'm conjuring a spirit, and if they don't come, I'm assuming it's for a reason. It could be me, like I could be the reason why they didn't come, but that's something I can determine through divination. But if they did hear me and they didn't come because they were busy doing something else, then it's always a matter of, if you couldn't come and be here with me now, come visit me in my dreams and we can like chat there, right? And I've had a lot of experience, especially with the Olympic spirits and it's funny, the Olympic spirits actually rarely show up in my dreams. It's always someone they send. It's like someone in a part of their legions. And I always tell people, the number of spirits that have come to me in my dreams and given me like their names or their seals. And then I try looking them up, and all the grimoires that I have, or looking them up online, and I can't find anything. And I'm like, well, okay, I guess we're gonna go with this. Like that happens a lot. So the Olympic spirits are mostly scrying in regards to like actually working with the Olympic spirits, but then I get a lot of stuff from them in dreams from spirits underneath of them that are like, yeah, we're here to help you with this thing that you asked for. Here, maybe the things you need to consider doing. So yeah, and even in dreams, it's a little bit more like a conversation than it is imaging, like images. Although dreams are obviously made up of images too, so you get both there.
I knew that I needed to up my dream game. That's completely fair. Thank you for that. So I will jump into the next question, which I reckon is the first controversial one. So beforehand, thank you for even like taking the time to look into this, because of
Oh, of
course,
course, yeah.
when I try to wrap my mind around, Catholicism and witchcraft, and I don't know. The first thing that came up, of course, is thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, and how Catechism seems to specifically list magic and sorcery as two of the serious sins against the first commandment, which incredibly, actually, you made me look at the first commandment in new ways since I first asked you about it. But because of that, do you find that to be antagonistic to your practice? And if not, please do explain how.
Yeah. No, I don't. And it's for two main reasons. One of which comes from the teachings of the Catholic Church, and the other is scriptural. And I'm going to warn people now. My answer to this is really long, so get some tears.
Go for it, because I think it really is one of the things that, I guess, blows the mind of someone that is not necessarily, including me, not necessarily that much educated about the actual workings of the scriptures and all of that, other than what we know about the church and, the Inquisition and stuff like that. So, yes, this is information that is necessary for people to know and understand. Please, be as long as you want.
Yeah. So the first reason is that it's not a dogma of the Catholic Church. And this is important because in order to become Catholic, there are certain dogmas that you have to believe in and agree to if you're actually going to be a practicing Catholic. And there are 225 infallible dogmas that include things like God as the one true God, Jesus is the Son of God, God is everywhere, present in created space. They're actually all things that, like, most Christians would already believe. I say 225 dogmas, and it sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. But it's things that we already believe. Like, if you are a Christian and you believe that God is, the one true God, like, most of these dogmas are things that you wouldn't disagree with at all. And they're online if people want to look them up. You can easily find a PDF of them and scan through them yourself. But I hold all of the Catholic dogmas to be true. There is no disagreement between me and those. But what often happens is that people take theological opinions of apologist individual Catholics on the street, and even the Catechism, and they treat it as a dogma when it's not. And so in the article that you provided to me, it mentions, that witchcraft is evil and it's a mortal sin because it breaks the first commandment. And to give people context, the first commandment comes from Exodus, and the verse is as follows. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me, right? That is the first commandment. So the assumption people make then is that if I'm practicing magic, I am placing other gods above the Christian God, which is actually not true. So ceremonial magic, and like we talked about before with a lot of the older grimoires, they're very Abrahamic. And God and his spirits are cited and praised to such extent that actually most pagans, like in the modern community, feel very uncomfortable when they engage with the grimoire tradition because of that heavily Christian element. So if witchcraft is evil, not by its inherent nature, but because it breaks the first commandment, what happens then if the first commandment isn't broken in the pursuit of magic? So this brings me to kind of the teachings of the Catholic Church on moral guidance. In order for something to be considered a mortal sin, which if you look at any, before you get a confession, right, that we have this examination of conscience that we're supposed to do. And if you look at any little pamphlet that they give you to help you with this examination, witchcraft is always, or the occult is always listed as a mortal sin. But in order for something to be considered a mortal sin, according to Catholic teaching, it must meet 3 requirements. It must be a grave matter, it must be done with full knowledge, and it must be done with full consent of the will. Now, I practice magic both with full knowledge and full consent, so those are checked off kind of immediately. And we're really left with the question of whether or not witchcraft is considered a grave matter. And in order for something to be considered a grave matter, one of the conditions is that it breaks one of the 10 commandments. So if you think about what most people consider is that witchcraft breaks the first commandment, then yes, it would be considered a grave matter. But in my practice, I don't place any other gods above God. So the first commandment isn't being broken in this case. Therefore, it's not a grave matter. Therefore, what I do is not considered mortally sinful, right? So that's the first reason. Any questions with that?
No, I genuinely, I am fascinated because, and we discussed about this before, like personally, it was one of the first questions I think that I asked you because, and that's what started fascinating me, is that, of course, translations and the commandments, I imagine originally were in Hebrew. Because the translation that I've always had in Italy, literal, if I translate it in English, which I imagine that comes from Latin, is, I am the Lord your God, you will have no other God other than me. So to me, the idea was like, oh, when you then explain it, oh no, when you see it as before God, I have nobody before it. And I was like, oh, this starts to make much more sense. Because also one of the things, this is not necessarily part of the question, but one of the things that actually I asked you for this is that my knowledge and my first-hand experience with Catholics in Italy, and probably the issue that I have with the church as an institution, was that it's always been instrumentalized to sort of impose one's will over another group. And so to me, it was genuinely amazing and surprising of how open-minded and actually tolerant, not just to say, but the famous love thy neighbor, I've never seen it actually performed and presented by people that declare themselves Catholic before you. Like the stuff that I've seen you post recently on Instagram as well about people condemning the fires in California to the fact that they've lost God, and you're like, this is not what we're taught. So I'm genuinely thankful to have been able to see that you have this generosity that I imagine was the original reason why we started being Catholics, and then it got a bit lost in the way for the majority then to have this perception of this is not what it is. This is just a way to impose someone's will over other groups of people. So that's just something that I'm very grateful for you. Because
Yeah, following this line for a second, and then I'll come back to the initial question. But there is, and it's funny you mentioned, cradle Catholic versus someone who chose to be Catholic. Because, and I'm not shitting on cradle Catholics here, because I know some people who are cradle Catholics who have done like substantial work and like really know our faith really well. But I think there's when someone converts to Catholicism, typically those people, at least in my experience, have a really like deep understanding of the Catholic Church, its teachings, and then how that applies to Scripture. And when you do that, you really quickly see that like the Catholic Church is all about love. It has always been about love, and it should continue to be about love. And even Pope Francis in his, people hate Pope Francis, even Catholics do, which is like absurd. But he really, if you look at his magisterial teachings, his magisterial documents that he's written, his kind of goal as, Pope and his purpose really is to show the love of Christ to everybody. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you believe. You are still loved. And like, that's such a critical component of like his magisterial teachings. And when you view a lot of his papal documents that have come out, part of his magisterium in recent years, like Fidaris Supplicans and all these other ones that like brought a lot of kind of discord within the Catholic community. People are saying, oh, he's going against Catholic teaching. And it's like, but he's not. And part of the reason why this is such a problem is because people take common theological opinion and they make it dogma. But it's not dogma. And if it's not dogma, you're not required to adhere to it. And so people have this like weird thing where it's like the church has all these rules and we must follow. And it's like, yes, there are certainly rules, but a lot of it isn't dogma. And so you don't have to adhere to it. Like, you could be a Catholic and never pray to Mary, and that would be fine. Like, it's not a requirement. You have to believe that Mary was born sinless and that she didn't have children. Like, there are some dogmas that you have to believe, but like, you don't have to engage with any saint anyway, and you can still be Catholic. So that's like one of the biggest fucking problems with the church, is that people take these opinions and make them dogma when they're not. And I think a lot of that just also comes from the church as an institution, right? It's easier to keep things in order if we like have this common understanding, but you can always push back. I mean, I've done this with priests and, I don't know how they took it necessarily, but where they said, this is the way things are. And I'm like, okay, but how did you get there, right? Like, what parts of the magisterium are you pulling from? Is it a dogma? And if it is, where was it founded as a dogma? Like, when was this infallibly taught to be true? I'm all for papal authority. Like, I think it's good. I think it's important for us to have as Christians, but we need to be careful not to make authority sound like anything the Pope or Bishop says is infallible and authoritative and blah. Like, the Pope is a fallible human being. He is not perfect. He says things sometimes that I'm like, don't necessarily agree with that, but like, I can see where you're coming from. And like, as Catholics, we are always supposed to respond in charity. So, trying to understand where they were actually coming from here. And you could disagree with the Pope if he's not speaking infallibly, right? And he only speaks infallibly in the seat of Peter on matters of faith and morals. But that whole like separation between, you know, the official infallible teachings of the church and like what its leaders say or even do is an issue that like the traditional Catholics have with those of us who, you know, are Novus Ordo. And it's like, it's a whole thing in just the Catholic sphere in general. But yeah, I think that's a really big misunderstanding is people think that, oh, everything that the Catholic Church teaches or everything that a priest says or everything that a bishop says or the Pope says, it's all meant to be taken as dogma. And that's not true. And so when you do that and you really see the distinction, it's easier to kind of separate those things from each other. And even there are some saints that the Catholic Church has canonized that like are very mystically inclined, dare you say magical, like Joan of Arc is one of them. And there are others too who have written things that, you know, some people in the modern world might actually say were heretical, but they're the teachings of the saints. They're not infallible teaching. You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to engage with it. And like, that's really important to keep in mind.
Thank you so much for that, which actually naturally brings me to the next question. So I am very grateful that you expressed your interpretation of why, your way at least to do witchcraft, you don't find it conflicts with the commandment and therefore dogma. But beside interpretation, does anybody in your congregation know that you practice? If they know, have you found tolerance? Have you been able to be open about it? Is it something, I don't know, that you felt free to discuss about?
No, it's not. And, you know, it's because people are so narrow-minded in that perspective that we just talked about. And if I were to just go in and say, you know, oh, I practice magic, right? Like their, I think initial reactions to that would be to like coil back and be like, oh my gosh, you practice magic, right? But it's really not. And the thing is that I'm going to be a little bit cruel here. There are so many people in the Catholic Church who haven't really looked into their faith and don't really understand where that distinction is found. And I have, because even like looking into, you know, we talked about how translations are a problem. And if you look at the word witchcraft in specifically that verse, it actually is referring to antisocial magic. The word is related to the word kesep, which at the time that Deuteronomy was written, which is where that verse comes from, the Israelites were being invaded by their neighbors, the Akkadians and the Neo-Assyrians. And it was under King Josiah's reign in like the 7th century. And because of that, right, you had foreign religion and like foreign religious elements and foreign gods coming in to mesh with the Israelites. And there was syncretism happening that shouldn't be happening according to the laws of God, right? The Jewish people are supposed to be set apart as the chosen people of God. And so this word, kesep, it actually is referring to magic that is intended to harm people. And even within Akkadian culture, you had the Ossipu, who were the good priests, like the good priests, but the priests who practiced, you know, magic that could purify somebody from the effects of this kesep, this like negative and like darker antisocial magic. Magic that, I think the way one scholar I read wrote about it, he said, you know, kesep was magic done to break bonds, to cause division between community, to cause harm to the individual. And so from like a religious standpoint too, the Akkadians had their own priests who would reverse that same kind of magic. And the whole idea of don't allow a witch to practice magic to live, it's really referring to the kesep, that like negative magic that is divisive in the community. And the book of Deuteronomy is saying, you know, don't go to these Ossipu, these Akkadian priests to like fix this problem when we have our own priests who have methods of purification and cleansing. The book of Leviticus, for example, gives a whole bunch of kind of cleansing rituals and rites that priests would use for the Israelite people. And so it's very much, it's not just witchcraft in the sense of, you know, anybody practicing magic like we see it today. It's a very specific type. It's antisocial magic. Sort of akin to what you might call baneful magic today, but like not necessarily exactly the same. And what they're saying is, you know, instead of going to these foreign priests to solve your problems, like go to your priest of your God to solve your problems. Like that is the issue here. And so when we talk about, you know, don't do magic and stuff here, really what it's referring to is, you know, don't go to another priest of another God or another religion to solve your problem. Like, the Catholic Church has sacraments for this reason. Like, we have ways of purifying if you've been exposed to something that is, like, inhibiting your ability to, enhance your relationship with God. We have those protocols in place. They exist in the church, and you should use them as a Catholic. Confession is really important. I mean, when I began doing Solomonic magic before I was Catholic, one of the things that you have to do is you have to recite the exorcism of the, I don't remember the official title, but anyways, it's essentially an exorcism that you have to saying like, I am sinful and I've done all these things, and I'm, showing that I'm sorry for both the things that I remember and the things that I don't remember, the things that I have done and potentially the things that I have failed to do. And by reciting that exorcism, you essentially ritually purify yourself before you go into ritual. And how much more powerful is it for me as a Catholic to be able to actually go to confession and confess all the things that I've, done or have failed to do, and be absolved of my sin, become ritually pure, even according to the church's tradition, and then to come back and be able to engage with the spirits of God who are, holier than I could ever be, goodness, and engage with them in this manner too, right? So it's even like Solomonic magic and Catholicism are like very kind of interrelated and like tied in the sense that, the absolution allows me to be really ritually pure in a way that previously I had to use, the confession of the exorcist, that's what it's called, my goodness. That plus like the Solomonic bath and all these things. But to go back to your real question, right? So no, people don't have any knowledge of what I do, magically speaking, in the church. And I don't really think they need to, right? Like, this is something that I think a lot of people want validation in what they do from people that they consider are really important to them. And while it would be nice to be able to share, like, my Solomonic practice, like, with people, because a lot of the insights I receive are, like, very applicable to Christian life, at the same time, I recognize that, for some people, engaging in the occult would pull them away from God. And I don't want to do that. And so it's also in the essence of, like, we should never cause our brothers and sisters to stumble. And, I fully recognize, because I was this person at one point, right, where, if you tell people that you can practice magic and not be out of line with the Catholic faith, first of all, most people won't believe you. But on the rare occasion that somebody will, they might go into things that actually will pull them away from God, and I wouldn't want that. Like, there are things that I won't do because it is against my religion. Like, there are practices of magic that I won't engage in because it goes against my faith. Kind of like, it's similar to how there's some traditional witches who will talk about, when you engage with the spirit or you make a pact with a particular spirit or a god, that there are certain taboos that you can no longer engage in, whether that be no longer eating meat, or, if you start getting into, I'm not an expert in the fairy tradition, so someone can correct me if I'm wrong here, you may not be able to have sex with somebody of a particular gender anymore. And those kind of taboos, like, exist in every religion, every culture, every tradition. And so, for me, like, I have religious taboos that translate to my magical practice and things that I can't do because I've, been baptized and I am now connected with the Christian God. And so I kind of think about it in those ways, right? So there's a couple reasons. I don't need validation from my congregation to do what I do. I've done the research. I know that what I'm doing is in line with the teachings of the church and with scripture. And I hold myself to a pretty strict, like, make sure that you double check before you do anything kind of deal. And I also don't want anybody to stumble. So I don't want to come in without also then being able to, like, guide them and say, you can do magic without breaking the rules of the church, but, like, we have to be very specific and particular about how we engage to ensure that we're not doing that. And it's all out of respect for God. Like, I think that's the other thing too. Sometimes people are like, oh, well, you're just doing it because the Catholic says you can't do it. And it's like, no. The Catholic Church is a fallible institution, and I am fully ready to say that. And I don't do it because the Catholic Church said I can't. I don't do it because it's disrespectful to God to do it. Like, one of the old things that used to happen in Acadia was there was a type of divination where people would call in a spirit, essentially. So you would put the bone of the animal or the person or whatever the spirit you're trying to call in your mouth, and then they would go into a trance, often using, like, psychoactive substances, and have the spirit speak through them. And according to Jewish law, right, putting a bone in your mouth is considered unclean. And so even though that is a part of the old law, and I'm technically not beholden to that, like, out of respect for God, I will never put a bone into my mouth and I will never use it to have the spirit communicate through me. I am not a vessel for a spirit. I am a vessel for God. And so it's even that way, right? Like out of respect for him, I will never allow a spirit to inhabit my body. That will never happen. Whereas there are plenty of people in the pagan community who have no issue doing that, and that's fine. And so it's those kind of things that prevent me from both telling people because I don't want to cause anybody to stumble, and also I just don't need their validation.
Fair enough. You briefly mentioned the point of like the church as an institution. So this again brings me naturally to the next question, which is the dealing with this institution and probably the popular reasons that are maybe considered by people that have something against the institution of the church. Like one of the things that came to mind probably because of my recent readings was the heretic movements that seem to start because at some point in the Middle Ages, the level of corruption in the church seemed to be to a level where you could buy indulgences into heaven. So if people have this kind of issue with the institution rather than the New or Old Testament, how do you think these two things can reconcile? Like, are there official ways for Catholics like you to present grievances and propose change and evolution in the institution? Like one thing that I discovered while I was researching for this is that not many people know, and I didn't, that technically I think John Paul II apologized for the Inquisition, while most people would still go to the idea of, no, you need to be burned at the stake. There seemed to be, at least from the point of view of someone like me, kind of a grinding effect between what the institution and the things that it imposes and the thing that it has instrumentalized somehow, like in colonialism and this kind of thing, and just a genuine want of being part of a community that shares your religious and spiritual values. So how do you reconcile those things?
Yeah. So the whole indulgence thing, like when we talk about the Protestant and Catholic rift, right? Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the wall, although actually that's a myth. He didn't actually nail them to the wall, but he certainly did express his grievances with the Catholic Church. And what people don't often realize after that is that the Catholic Church like looked at what he said and they were like, oh, yeah, like this has been taken too far. We actually need to change how we do things. So the Catholic Church is not against change. I mean, if this is something that isn't dogma, right, hasn't been infallibly declared, then we can change it and that's fine. And we should, in like matters where we've done things like have let people pay for indulgences, like that should have been changed, and it was, thank goodness. And so it's not, people think that the Catholic Church is like against change, entirely. And it's like, they're really not. And if you really have a grievance, like you can discuss it with your priest. There's nothing that stops a faithful Catholic from writing to your priest, to your bishop, to the Pope even. You're allowed to go to the highest, parts of the organization and say, hey, this thing that's happening is like not cool. And this is a problem and we need to consider changing it. And you can engage in that discourse with them. And engage faithfully in the sense of don't just go and be like, I'm right. And if they don't, give you what you want, then you're going to leave the faith. Like, even though, our priests and our popes and our bishops, they're all people and they're all fallible and they're all sinners. A lot of them are really well versed in both Catholic theology and in the scriptures. And so it's worthwhile engaging in a dialogue with them to talk about these really harsh topics. I remember when I was going through RCAA, bless Father Patrick, he is so patient with me, but I asked him a lot of really hard questions, like things on abortion, things on divorce, and I was like, I really want to understand like where we're coming from, because this is a teaching, right, that people use to hurt other people. So why do we believe that this is the case? And for example, for abortion, and this may not be good enough for some people, and that's totally fine. Like if you're not Catholic, you don't have to give a fuck. But the reason why abortion is considered a sin in Catholicism is because procreation is the only time in which humans are able to co-create with God. And like, that's an incredibly sacred and special thing for us to be able to do. We are incapable of creating new life from nothing in the way that God is, right? And even like for humans, right, materially, we require the egg and the sperm. So like, we're not really capable of creating from nothing the way God is. But we are then co-created. He creates a soul from nothing and embeds it into the material to create a person. And so it's the only time in which we can co-create. And like that is incredibly sacred to people who believe in God. And so that's why it's a sin to abort, because that human is just evidence of God's creation. And it's the same reason why we shouldn't be burning down forests and destroying like the world like we are for, consumeristic purposes, because it was created by God. It's a sacred and a holy thing. Like, we shouldn't be treating it with such disrespect. And so, I asked him a lot of those really hard questions, and he was willing to have those conversations with me. And the same is true for any bishop. And like, I've gotten to speak to, my bishop a couple of times, and we've had some really great conversations, and he's, been very insightful. But the other thing too is that, the church has had a lot of scandals, a lot of abuse scandals, that have like really harmed a lot of people. And I get really mad at the Catholics who were like, try to say that it didn't happen, or it didn't happen the way people said it. And I'm like, but it did. Like, you like, stop trying to pretend that it didn't happen and it didn't hurt people, and that we didn't have priests who were sinfully engaging with young children. Like, that is not the way to handle this issue. And it actually has caused the church to change. So, and nowadays, if you notice something happening, like abuse of a priest with an elderly person, or, you encounter, sexual abuse with a young minor, like, Catholics are both encouraged and frankly required to report this to the local authorities. And then once you report it to the local authorities, you can then report it to the church, to the local priest, to the bishop, to your diocese leaders. And actually every diocese has a coordinator, and you can also report it to them as well. So the church does have methods of reporting things, and you should do it. Like, the other thing too is that, as Christians, we're called to, as Christ said, give unto Caesar what is due to Caesar. And we're also called to follow the laws of the country that we're in. And so if you see a crime, it is your duty as a citizen of the country to report the crime. It doesn't matter that it's with clergy. You don't have the same, requirement that the clergy does not to take what someone gives them in confession and report a crime that way. Like, they are bound by like a sacramental obligation not to break that seal, but like, we are not bound in that same obligation. And so if you see a crime, you hear about a crime, like, you are duty bound to report it according to scripture. Like, it is not optional. And I think people have this weird thing where they're like, well, but the priest is this holy man. And I'm like, they are human. They are a priest and they are ordained by God, but they are human and they can do crimes like every other person can. And so if you see a crime, you are obligated to report it as a Catholic, both to the local authorities and to the church. And like, I say all of this, right? And there are methods, but like, I just want to be very clear that the methods aren't necessarily enough, and there's more we could be doing. And, the other thing too is that like, the church, when they do like their internal audits and their internal, courts and whatever, they're really slow. They take for fucking ever. And it's just like, it's not fast enough in the church. And this is like why it's also important to get the local authorities involved. If you want, not that, our actual legal system is any better, but at least if you get the local authorities involved, you're no longer just relying upon the church to do its job, because even though it should do its job, the church is made up of fallible people and a fallible institution, therefore it doesn't always do its job very well. And so you should still kind of do the same things that you would for any kind of other crime. So, keep evidence, like whether that be emails or, testings or whatever the case may be. Have the evidence and have that ready to present to the clergy. And if they don't listen to you, then go to the bishop. And then if he doesn't listen to you, go to the fucking pope. Like, there are people you can go to, and you can take it as far up the chain as you need to. And getting the local authorities involved will also kind of help speed that process along, right? Because now we're actually in trouble with the law. All that to say that there are ways. It's not a perfect system. No system is perfect, right? But the church has learned, they have changed, and they can change in the future. But if we want them to change, we have to, as congregants, be the ones to bring it up. If no one says anything, nothing will change. And so, I sometimes appeal to my fellow Catholics where it's like, I understand that you see these people in a holy light, and nobody wants to admit that somebody that you've really looked up to has done these horrible things. But it doesn't change the fact that it happened, and like, that person should be held accountable. Just like we will, eventually in heaven be held account for the actions that we've taken. The same is true here on earth. I mean, that's the whole point of purgatory, is that we must pay the price for our temporal sins, the sins that, we've, the consequences of the sins that we've, done on earth. Like, when you go to confession, those temporal sins are forgiven, but that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences to those sins. And so the consequence of committing a crime is then, doing the time, essentially. And that doesn't go away just because you're a holy person.
Fair. More fair than I had understanding of. Thank you so much. Well, we discussed the thing about the opposition in a way that I saw between Catholicism and witchcraft, and the next point that I would have, maybe it would have been better actually to discuss before, it was about Catholicism and patriarchy, because as an accomplished researcher and, studied and teaching person yourself, I was made aware of the writings, I think specifically of St. Paul, that tend to be unequivocally misogynistic, and I was wondering how you reconcile with the patriarchal messages of the Old and New Testament, basically.
Yeah. Oh, St. Paul, the beloved of the Protestants. So most people cite Paul's words in Corinthians and in the book of Timothy, right? There's a really great book by John Temple Bristow called What Paul Really Said About Women. And in this book, he really breaks down those verses in their kind of cultural context and then in kind of the historical context of the time. And if you're getting a theme here, it's that people don't look at the historical and cultural context of anything. But so really, if you actually look at the words of Paul, and I'm going to kind of summarize Bristow's argument here, but I really encourage people to go read the book. If you look at the time of Paul, the things that he says are actually like pretty radical for the time and the understanding of the place of women. So the Greco-Roman world, which is kind of when this was being written, had this deeply ingrained notion of gender roles that kind of wielded a really substantial influence over societal norms and practices. And Judaism at the time is also a very male-dominated religion, right? So when, Paul says in Galatians 3:28, I think it is, he says something along the lines of like, in Christ there is no longer Greek and Jew, there is no longer slave or free, and there is no longer male or female. What he's trying to get at here is that, we're all equal under the auspices of Christ. There is no separation between us as people. And that's a wild thing to say in a society where there are such distinct separations, right? Slave or free, male or female, Jew or Greek. Like the Jews didn't want to engage with the Gentiles. And like, I would be considered a Gentile Christian, for example. And so he also in Ephesians has this call to, have mutual submission in relationships. And people often take this as like, the female must submit to the male and blah, blah, blah. That's a total mischaracterization of what Paul is saying here. If we are to have mutual submission, it means that neither person is above the other. And we equally submit to each other out of love, right? And that is supposed to be a reflection of the love Christ has for his church. And like, so it's taken vastly out of context there. And then Bristow essentially argues that the verses quoted by Paul, or the verses of Paul quoted by other people, are often taken as like this blanket statement towards all women, which neglects the context of the fact that when Paul wrote these letters, so a lot of the epistles, like in the New Testament, for example, these letters, he wrote them to specific churches, and he wrote them because he had heard through whatever means that something was happening in the church that was contrary to Christian thought and Christian teaching. So it was never meant, none of these letters were meant to be some kind of blanket statement about how Christianity should be. It was him writing to address these specific churches and the issues that they were having. So, for example, in Corinthians 14, he says, women should remain silent in churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. Now, if he meant what we would understand here at a surface level, then we also have to find a way to justify what he says 3 chapters earlier in Corinthians 11, when he says that women can pray and prophesy in church. Which is it? Are we to be silent? Are we to pray and prophesy? You have two contrary things happening here. And there's a similar issue in Timothy where Paul says, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. And this passage causes a lot of bristling amongst people, both in the church and outside the church. And really, Bristow says, and he's not the only one, there's lots of biblical scholars that would agree with this, that say, the word authority here translates from the Greek word authentine, I think is how you say it. And it's really about a misuse of power than it is like a hierarchical authority structure. And so it's not even that a woman can't have authority, because actually we see Paul addressing and respecting women in positions of the deacon in the early church. So, for example, he in Romans he introduces Phoebe, who was a female, as a deacon of the church. And if you know anything about church structure, you have like the pastor or the priest, for example, and then you would have the deacon, and they're kind of like in Protestantism, the deacon is often like the leadership of the church, the deacon and the elders. And then you have the congregation, right? So a deacon, a woman, is above. She's in a position of authority. So this is not a condemnation of women being in places of authority. It's a condemnation towards the misuse of authority within these churches. And so he, says that, he greets this Phoebe as a deacon of the church. And interesting fact, he uses the same word. So this word that translates to deacon for himself, as he also does for Phoebe. So he's put, like, they're on equal level, like on equal standing here. He's not putting himself above her, and she's not above him. Again, we get to this idea that there is neither male or female in the church. Like, they are on equal standing. And then, he also, in Romans, he also mentions Unia, and he identifies her as this outstanding woman among the apostles, a great teacher. She's a leader in that church as well. And there are more examples, like there's, Priscilla and Aquila. And so my ultimate point here, right, is that while it seems to be very misogynistic and patriarchal, if you actually read Paul's word in context, he's not saying that women are to take a secondary role in the church, but like they are to be held in esteemed like places of leadership as well. And typically you have people instead take it as a blanket statement, which is just frankly absurd. And it's against the very example that Christ set in his own ministry. Like, women played such a critical role in his ministry. If you read the scriptures, Mary Magdalene was the beloved of Christ, and she was a teacher among the apostles. And there were other women who financed his ministry. And like, if there's always a story of Lazarus, being risen from the dead, and Christ went because it was two women who called for him to go. It was actually outside of his initial kind of planned path. And he went because they sent him like a tearful message being like, our brother has died. Do you not care about him? And he went because the women called, not because anybody else called, but because the women asked him to go. He placed such critical importance on women. And so to claim otherwise is both ahistorical, it's against the teachings of even the Catholic Church, and even it's against Scripture.
So technically that was my last question, and I'm very happy to close things here, because one of the most important things for me when I even started to think about this interview, which I'm honestly so grateful for, because so many things need to be in context, and popularly they are not the way that, again, Catholicism is portrayed and is popular. Does not go along with things that someone as well studied and well versed in the scripture as you are would share and discuss. So thank you for that. And also I gave myself the rule, and I told you about, even if I get curious, I don't want to use these as, oh, but what about then? Like I genuinely thank you so much for having spent thought and time into this. So I'm very, very grateful for that. And just
an aside, if people ever have like a what abouts, like it's fine to ask those questions, because we as Christians are called to know how to defend our faith, and that applies for me with like magical practice as well. But I think in the modern like world, those questions are often discouraged, and they really shouldn't be. No one should ever be scorned for being critical of a religion. And so those, well, what about questions? Like, those have a place, and people should be allowed to ask them. And so, if you ever see me in a server and you have a like, well, what about question, you're welcome to tag me. We can have that conversation. I'm more than happy to discuss it with you. But yeah, so we often say that those shouldn't be allowed, but like they most definitely should. So, note to all your viewers, I guess, really, that don't ever feel afraid of, really pushing and getting people to talk about their faith.
I'm saying that because while we were having a discussion, I took 3 notes, and technically I have extra questions. If you like, I have these things.
No, yeah, ask away. Have at it.
Okay. One of the points of how you discussed earlier, the way that the institution like takes time, and sometimes sometimes it doesn't, it's not that obvious for it to change. The fact that that if most people haven't done the study that you have done, might have wrongly, but present criticism at best for the work that you do in Solomonic magic. So one of the first things that would come to mind, and that's the funny thing, I was so excited about this interview that I spoke to two people that I know that were raised like me in Italy, and neither of them are practicing Catholics anymore. And they were surprised at it, and I was like, both of them brought up to me the fact that, well, if she has learned so much and she cares and it works for her spirituality, why can't she just do it on her own? Why does she have to be part of the institution of the church? The institution of the church is so, has been at the very least so problematic. Like, why add to the numbers of an institution that has been used at times to harm people? Feel free to tell me, mind your fucking
totally
business.
legitimate question, like good question to ask. So yeah, why am I so I could practice Solomonic magic without being Catholic, which is absolutely true. So why have I chosen to then join an institution that has done so much harm? And there's really
It's
two
not
reasons.
even just the idea of Solomonic magic and Catholicism. Like, you could be Catholic, and I think the idea is doing all those things and going to church and all of that, but not necessarily. I guess it's the difference, because all three of us, ironically, are still officially part of the church because we've been baptized.
Yeah.
So the idea is we're not, none of us is anymore a Catholic practitioner, but also we're not necessarily out of the church. But the fact that we don't necessarily practice, I guess, is what makes us feel, oh, but we're not endorsing or support, despite the fact that, well, personally, not necessarily so much for me, but I know of these people instead being more like, oh no, I do believe absolutely in Jesus, in Mary, and all those things, but the way that things have been enforced from scriptures and all these things, I cannot in good conscience associate myself with an institution that
Oh
is
yeah.
being used against queer people, especially because these are queer people as well, so it's all that.
I mean, so I would I engage with the church because I think from a spiritual perspective, right? They offer sacraments that I cannot get elsewhere. Like sacraments where we get the grace of God passed down through them. Like that's the whole point that they exist. And so, it's a really critical, in my opinion, to be a faithful Catholic in that regard. But I think my other answer to that would be, it is much easier to call for change within the system. And there are things in Catholicism that I don't support, and I'm vocal about it. Like, there are charities that we have that I don't support. There are things that people will say that aren't dogmas, right? That I'm like, nope, don't support that either. And it's good as a Catholic to be able to have those conversations with other Christians, because one of the things that tends to happen is, and this shouldn't happen, but it does, is that when people who are Christian engage with non-Christians and we bring up these kind of topics, right, they either go into denial or they go into, well, you're just trying to make my religion look bad. And it's like, no, there are issues with the church and the things that they believe and the things that they support. And so it's not even when those things come up, right, it's a personal choice for me not to support them at all. But it's also a matter of, I, as somebody who holds to the faith, I go to mass with you and we go to the same confessional priest, as somebody who and who engages in your religion with a faith that, is the same as yours. In many ways, they will listen to me more in a sense because we have that camaraderie, right? Compared to somebody who just from the outside is they would perceive it as, I'm just shitting upon the church. And so when I can bring these issues up and be the things that you did, or when you engaged in this particular act, that's not cool. And, here are the teachings of the church, and here's where it's found in scripture, and here's all this evidence as to why it's a bad thing to do this. They have a more open ear because of that camaraderie. So the secondary reason is really, I'm in it because I do want to cause change. And I see the harm that the church has done and is doing. And it's important for Catholics not to be closed-minded about that and to be able to acknowledge it. I mean, so many of Christ's teachings encourage us to do this, and yet we don't do it. And so if I can make that change in the church, like as somebody who they had that camaraderie with, then I want to. And like, I've written letters to my bishops about things that they're supporting that I don't agree with. Like when in my state, we had a law that we were voting on, and like we had a whole sermon on like why you should vote for this anti-abortion law. And I remember I wrote a letter to both my diocese head, and I also wrote a letter to the priest who like runs most of my church. And I was like, hey, this is like not cool. Like we shouldn't have a whole priest. I come to mass to be filled with the word, not to hear about something that is not Catholic dogma. And really, like, even though it has basis in scripture, like telling people to just go blindly vote for it is not the way to do it. If you want to teach on why abortion is against the church, then you need to be citing scripture. You need to be citing like church fathers. I mean, like just blindly doing the like, it's wrong and it's immoral. Like, stop. And so we can have those harder conversations with them in the church in a way that I couldn't necessarily have and be listened to as much from outside the institution. Right. That would be my answer.
That's fascinating because I completely understand the idea of you either fight a system or you try to change it from within. And I do both in different situations. So I completely understand that. It's interesting what you brought up about the people in authority in the church just telling their congregation, oh, you just go and vote for that. Because the next thing that came to mind was like, what about the times that religion is used, instrumentalized for politics? Because something that unfortunately I had to look into recently is how the far right of the Republicans have used a lot of Christianity in general, not just Catholicism, to basically support the concept of patriarchy and the nuclear family and against reproductive rights. And I understand why it usually seems a conversation closer to the fact that it's against my religion. And it's also actually connects to something else that I was going to ask for personal interest, because one of the things that I do is intersectionality training. And one of the main points that I've been working recently, which is not technically part of it, but I think it's very important, because I am speaking to people that are Catholics, Christians, from Islam, and this thing about, it's against my religion. I sometimes have, my main issue is using something that is personal to affect somebody else's freedom. And I have this perception of boundaries beginning and ending with the body of someone. So something that I was trying to understand how to explain in the best possible, with the best possible empathy, because again, it's not just something that I want to challenge. Like I do believe that some people, especially in the in lower level of congregation, like I'm sure that the higher you're going in ranks, the more the politics are understood. But if you're part of a congregation, you just believe who's above you and tells you what you need to do to be saved, basically. So I was like, the idea of, I cannot be in the presence sometimes of a queer person because what they do goes against what I've been told is right. And so being in their presence tarnishes me. And therefore, if I believe that by being in presence of you, it's going to affect my salvation, then I have the right to impose on you not to be here. And it was just a matter of understanding how, like unfortunately, religion is instrumentalized this way. And do you have a way to try and understand and reason, like in situations like you were saying, your diocese just told everybody to vote like that, and rightfully you said something against. But how is there a way to be more vocal about separating those things and emphasizing your freedom begins and ends with you, though? And the entire point of loving thy neighbor shouldn't be that. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I am a firm believer in the separation of church and state. Like what is happening in the current administration is absolute garbage, and it shouldn't be allowed to happen. Like we should be, as a church, we should be following the teachings of Christ, where it's, follow the laws and like be a good citizen, but don't impose your religion upon people who don't give a fuck. Like that is so inappropriate for us to be doing. And, there was a recent interview with J.D. Vance, the vice president of the states, and he recently said, he was talking about the immigration issue in America, and he said something along the lines of, we should be putting Americans first and not allowing immigrants and all these things. And I remember just sitting there being like, when was the last time you sat down and read the Bible? Because like Christ talks all the time about loving people who from foreign places who are, you know, in the Bible, it's often called Gentiles, right? It's people who are not Jews, but it's not like you use in a derogatory. I mean, it is sometimes, but it shouldn't be used in a derogatory term, as a derogatory term. But like these people who are not part of your country, they're equally as deserving of love. They're equally as deserving of resources to live a good life. And this idea that like we should exclude people who aren't American and not provide them the resources, not give them what they need to just like live, like literally live, is against scripture. It's against biblical teaching. Like that should not ever have been said. And he was like, I'm a Catholic. And then I was like, you're not a Catholic if you're saying that shit. Like you are not. You're going against the church. There should be a separation of state and church. They should not be involved with each other. No law should be created with like some kind of religious framework in mind. That is absolutely not appropriate. And you know, it's really hard to speak out against it because, you know, people say things like, well, I personally morally cannot vote for something that doesn't agree with like what I believe. And I think that to an extent you don't have to engage in things that don't align with your belief. It is not appropriate for you to vote for something that, based on your beliefs, that impacts people who are not a part of your belief system, right? And this is like why the incorporation of religion into politics is a problem, because people make it an individual issue, but it's actually not. And so we need to have that separation of, if I'm voting on something like church documents and stuff, like we sometimes get votes on like whether something can be included in the church. And in that case, like, yes, vote along with your Catholic morals and teachings because it's something that will apply only to the church. But the United States is made up of hundreds of millions of people and of varying religions and varying traditions. And so it is not appropriate for us to say, oh, well, my religious conscience tells me that I can't, or like I should go this way. But it's like, but it's not about you. It's not about your religion. This is a law that applies to everybody who lives in the country. And so if they don't believe in what you do, then it's not applicable to them. And we need to change the framing, right? That when we're voting for a law, that it's, you know, you have to vote with your, you know, your individual moral conscience. And it's like, no, you need to vote knowing that this law is for a group of people larger than the church. And so we can't impose our teachings upon them. That conversation is hard to have with Christians. Admittedly, I've had it. And I get a lot of pushback and a lot of, well, I get a lot of like emotional pushback where it's like, no, that they rarely actually cite anything to say, you know, that it's not true, because I give them other citations. It's a hard conversation to have. It's not perfect, you know, fighting against it and trying to place that barrier. But, you know, the best thing we can do is try and like just make our voices heard and make them known. Write the letters, right? Like, you know, when J.D. Vance did that thing, I remember I had Catholic Bible study like a couple days later, and I brought it up and I was like, you know, what do you guys like think about this? And, you know, do you think he was right? Do you think he was wrong? And we had a really good conversation about it. And, you know, I think I got some people to see my side of the view. I think some people just didn't, which is also, you know, fine. But even just that, right? Like starting small and getting people to try and see things again, when you grow up Catholic or you're cradle Catholic, you know, you're taught to like do whatever you're told. And it takes sometimes a fresh perspective to be like, no, like blind following is never the answer. And so as someone like who converted, and it's so funny because I'll cite things and they're like, I've never heard of that before. It's because I've had to do like a lot of research to understand my faith to its fullest extent. And it's like the things that you were taught to be absolutes are not absolutes. And like, it's funny to see kind of the wool being pulled like out from over people's eyes, because they begin to see how like it's not as black and white. It's not as cut and dry. It's a lot more nuanced in these conversations. And so really like that's been something, you know, after becoming Catholic, where it's like, it's really important for me to call out that kind of stuff when I see it, because otherwise it will never change. And it kind of has to start small. There was a second part of your question that I missed. So it was like politics and religion shouldn't be intermixed. And then there was something else you mentioned.
Oh, it was mostly that, like it was because you covered it perfectly in the fact that, yeah, we shouldn't impose by our religion on a vote things on others, because I think, yeah, the using religion for politics, therefore brings actions that affect people beyond our personal boundaries. And so you covered it perfectly. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I would,
it's really frustrating. I wish people wouldn't do it. And like I just think it's weird, right? That like Catholics will say, "Oh, well, I won't impose what I believe on like someone I meet on the street." And I'm like, "Okay, so you won't do it on an individual basis, but you will do it on a like much larger scale basis when we're talking about the fucking government." So like, which is it? Like, you can't pick and choose, and you have to be consistent. And even like pointing out those inconsistencies can be helpful, where it's like, so it only applies on the individual level, but like not on the political level, and like, why is that? And getting them to, because a lot of times people, they can't even like actually explain why they do it; they just do it. And so when you're able to kind of pick away and be like, no, I want to understand why. Like, why are you doing this? And what's your reasoning for it? And then when they can't give a reason, that can be really eye-opening for people. I mean, it's been eye-opening to me in the past, trying to just get them to see the flaw in their own system and their own thinking, and being like, you are working on a conditioned mindset, and I need you to understand that the conditioning is not the truth. Like, this is something you were told, but there's all these other sources that say this other thing, right? So, okay, that was a aside.
no, that's absolute. I understand that completely, because the first 16 years that I was like raised Catholic, went to mass every week and all of that, that was exactly it. Like,
Yeah.
I know the mass by memory because I've seen it so many times as a child that it just gets to you and you just learn it by memory without really understanding what it says. Last year, I don't know, I probably mentioned it. Yeah, I did mention it to you because also, like, yeah, you were very, very kind. Last year, around this time, I went to mass again after decades, and it was very impressive to see it with adult, fresh eyes, and immediately realizing this is a ritual, this is a spell. Like the priest is asking us to give them energy to do the transubstantiation. It was incredible to see it with enough distance to understand that. But as you do it and you repeat it when you're born in it, I think there is indeed a value in the work that you have done that people that are born within Catholicism sometimes never have to do. So I'm not
Well, yeah,
surprised
and
that
within
they can just
Protestantism too,
repeat.
like it's a common issue. I think anybody who's born in a faith should, really like take a serious look at what you're being told and like what they're, telling you. Like, it's the whole reason I left Protestantism, because I actually began looking at what they were saying and I was like, it's not lining up. Like, the things that you're telling me, you're either not holding to, so you're being hypocritical, or you says that it says this, but it actually doesn't say that. So like, it doesn't matter what religion you're born into. I think it's really critical for people to, look at your sacred text, look at the teachings of, the people who your religion makes out as teachers. Don't just take people's word for it. Never take people's word for anything. As a scientist, I think this has been really ingrained in me over the years. But when people say things and I don't take their word for it, I think sometimes people take offense at that, and it's like, it's never meant to, be offensive, but like, there are so many people who kind of just accept things, out of like, for good intentions, right? But it's, you can still be accepting misinformation, and it is our job as individuals and as institutions to make sure that we're checking what we put out into the world, making sure that it's accurate and it's true, and all these things. And if there's other perspectives, to present those perspectives. It's a very academic kind of way of thinking, and I think more people could really like use that in engagement of their critical thinking. We weren't given brains for nothing. Like, the intelligence of the human is a gift. I mean, for the Catholic tradition, it's a really sacred gift from God. And to just accept blindly what people tell you without engaging with that, it's actually against Catholic teaching, first of all, to not engage with rationality and with reason. And it's just bad for humanity in general, as we're seeing evidence to currently in the state of the world.
If you allow me, I will ask you a last question. It's the only one or main one about witchcraft, because you are a very specific kind of person with the kind of generosity that you have with sharing your practice. Having practiced myself for the last a little bit over a couple of years, I have had a first-hand chance to see the kind of generosity that you have towards other practitioners. And I've never found anyone that, when somebody asks in need, is so open. There's always this thing, and I don't know if it's because a lot of people say, oh, my practice, my rituals, my spells are very personal, which I completely understand. So I can give you an idea, but I cannot give you details of how you can perform it. You need to understand and personalize to a degree, which to a degree I understand. But especially when I was a completely newbie, the level of generosity that you've had in, you know what, you need to do these, and these, like a list of things, which I don't know if it's because you are scientific minded, but it's a level of generosity with your practice that I don't see around, and I wish to see more around. Why is that? Why are you not a gatekeeper?
I am in some aspects. So like, thank you for being so kind, but I most definitely am a gatekeeper in some ways. Like, there's a lot of things that I don't share with the public in relation to kind of my Solomonic practice and like a lot of the work that I do with the Olympic spirits. But I, there's this, I think people abuse the thing that Agrippa says, which is, be silent. And this is a commonly held thing in the Golden Dawn too, but like you should be silent about your practice and not share things. And I think that's true to an extent. Like I think personal revelations and things like should be kept very personal and very private. And a lot of my work with like these spirits is very theurgic. And so there are a lot of just like personal messages that I don't feel the need to share with people. But, no one who comes into the witchcraft community, like when you first begin, you don't know anything and you don't know any better. And I think that's where when people, gatekeep, it's like, the how. I mean, I think earlier in this interview, we're like, how do you hear the spirits? Like, those are useful conversations to have with people. Like, how did you learn how to scry? Like, I have book recommendations, but there are also just things that I learned, kind of tips and tricks that I picked up from doing it. And, there's a lot of people who you don't necessarily have the drive to do a lot of that experimentation themselves. And the world is made up of many, different kinds of people. And I think it's a really unfortunate, actually, that the people who like are willing to do the experiments, right, aren't willing to share it. And it's like, you did the experiment because you wanted to know something. And there's a pretty good possibility that somebody else has the same question. So, why wouldn't you share that information to help them grow in their own practice? And I was having this conversation with a member of my ritual group like the other weekend when we met. And, we were talking about how the occult community doesn't want to grow magicians. And that's really unfortunate. Like we should be wanting to, make a new and upcoming, because like a lot of our elders are kind of moving out of the like the stream, especially in ceremonial magic. Like a lot of our scholars, a lot of our practitioners that like I've looked up to, they're getting old, and I still love them dearly. Like don't get me wrong. Stephen Skinner is still like a great inspiration, and all these other people, but they are getting old, and the kind of the things that they're thinking and the ways that they're doing things, like they're not new and novel. And new and novel isn't bad. It's innovative. And there are a lot of people who are kind of coming up and taking these places and sharing that innovation. And I think we should be mentoring and really, building up and fostering these people who like want to become good magicians, and we should be encouraging that. And, giving vague answers is like not the way to do that. And so, when I can, I wanted to show people that there are multiple ways of doing magic, and that's the other thing too. I think people have this idea that magic has like one singular thing, right? I mean, I see candle spells all over the place, and I'm like, there's more than a candle spell. But even just like showing kind of the difference in complexity of like the magic that you can do. So like I gave you that psalm spell, right? But I've given other people like larger things and different things that really are like tuned to their specific issue. And I even think like it would be really useful for people to do something where, like, let's walk through how, like, I, for example, take a spell from idea to actual ritual. Like, what is the process? Because I think a lot of people, what they do, especially when you're a beginner, is you look at, like, a book like the Llewellyn's Spell a Day or whatever, and, we do that. And that's great. Like, I always tell people, I don't like those books personally, but I'm also years in my practice. They're not useful for me anymore. But, like, if that spell a day is what gets you to do magic, then yes, like, please do it. Because you don't learn about magic unless you do magic. And if that's how we have to start, then go for it. Like, that's great. But at some point, we need to learn how to kind of take all these different elements and put them together in a single thing, because it allows you to like tailor things more specifically to what you actually need. And I think in sharing those spells, a lot of times it's also just me trying to be like, I had a similar situation, right? And like, this is how I handled it. Like, this is what came out of that from, problem to solution to execution. It's a lot of it's that too. So the generosity is just trying to really like help people become better magicians. Being vague never helped anybody. It never fucking helped anybody in the scientific community either. So like that's not what's teaching people. And I really I wish I had a space, and I could start a YouTube channel, but I don't have time for that, nor do I want to, where we could have a class or something where it's how do you take a spell from 0 to 100? Because that is really, I think, one of the more critical kind of bottlenecks of people doing magic, is that they don't really know how. And there are some books that have done a really good job of kind of helping you with that. I think Jason Miller's Elements of Spellcrafting gives you some really great tips, although it doesn't actually get you from 0 to 100. But just talking to people from different traditions, right? And it's how do you formulate this? And how would you go about doing it? And what are the considerations? Magic is a spectrum in terms of the complexity. And I say this about planetary timing a lot too. It's also a spectrum, and you have to ask yourself, when you are doing a spell, what do you actually need? Do I need to do planetary timing here? Because if I don't, then I'm not going to do it. When I work with the saints, for example, I don't do any kind of planetary timing with saints. Nothing. It's really it's a novena, and maybe some offerings of water, or if there's it's what's on their feast day, right? I'll cook a meal that is specific to the saint. I go to mass on their feast days. There are other ways to work saint magic. I don't need to incorporate the ceremonial things into that, because it doesn't really have a place there. Whereas something like a pick trick selection, yes, the astrological is really critical. And I need to be more specific with the timing. But even the protection around your home, right? I was telling, who was I talking to the other day? I don't remember. But someone was saying that, they think ceremonial magic is really a gatekeeping and a bottleneck thing. And I was but the thing is that, not everything I do is ceremonial. I think people will be very surprised at sometimes how folky the stuff that I do looks like, but it's because I'm willing to admit when a full conjuration is not actually going to solve my problem. There are other means, and this also gets into, Agrippa's 3 worlds and how these are all interconnected. You have the natural world, you have the astrological, and then you have the celestial. Or he would say natural, celestial, and intellectual worlds. But this idea that there's this spanning, right? And you don't have to use all of it in one thing. You can pick and choose kind of what best fits things. So for example, one of my protection rituals for my home is me going through all of my rooms and reciting deliverance psalms. And then I have a small ritual I do with an Olympic Spirit ally of mine to kind of reset the space. But that initial it's protection. I literally pray deliverance psalms. That's it. I don't do anything special. I have an incense blend, which is garlic. It's essentially an exorcism blend. It's garlic skins. I found it. I was given it by Balthasar Conjure, but it's garlic skins, coffee grounds, benzoin, and then salt. I think it's those ones. You grind them up, and that's your incense blend. But have that, and then I pray deliverance psalms in every room in my house, and that's it. Bang, done. Right. But there are other times I go full crazy and do the whole Solomonic ritual thing for maybe something else, or you do the whole pick trick selection thing for another. It's a scale, and teaching people about the scale and figuring out where things fit and then what you need to pull in, I think is really important. And this is why I sound like a fucking broken record. If you haven't read Agrippa, you have to read Agrippa, for the love of all that is holy. People don't like it because it comes across very Christian, which again, I totally get. But he talks about so much magical theory that is really critical to your understanding of why magic works the way it does. I've had so many new people who come and will ask questions of where do the correspondences come from? And I'm read Agrippa. And because Agrippa has a whole, in the first book actually, and we just cover this in my Agrippa book club that I host on Hearth server. But in chapters 27 through 30 or something along those lines, it essentially, Agrippa gives you a way to determine the correspondence with something without knowing, right? And this is something too that people will often ask, well, what do I do if it's not in a book that I have, right? How do I know the correspondence? And he essentially says, there are things you can consider, right? What does it look like? What does it smell like? What does it produce when you harm it? If you bruise it or something? What smell does it produce? All these things, use your senses to help you determine what something is. And so, for example, anything that stings you is considered martial because it hurts. It brings pain, right? Onions, when you cut them, even though their color is lunar because it's white, when you cut it, it produces that enzyme that causes you to tear up, right? So it's actually martial in that way. Why are things that are hot considered martial? Because both the red color and the heat, it causes pain. Those are why these things have those associations. And when you have kind of this broader understanding of how do I figure out what correspondence something has, it really allows you to be a lot more experimental and even just creative in your magic, because you're able to see, you know, oh, this thing that isn't in this book, I would associate it with this because of these particular reasons. You know, getting people to look more into magical theory, you know, I do think reading philosophy will help, you know, a lot. People often, like, I think in Matt Aron's book, he talks about like the tripart soul or something, but that is taken from Aristotle's idea of the tripartite soul. And it's just heavily modified to such an extent that it like doesn't actually have any meaning. But like it comes from
Recently, I
what?
discovered it's apparently something that we do in modern witchcraft a lot. I would love a good source on everything, and I don't think it takes away from us like taking it and adapting it. But recently, I found I hear a lot about the exercise of the ball of energy. So you make the ball of energy, you feel it, you throw it to people, people feel it, send it back. It's a Tai Chi exercise I discovered, and
Yes,
that
it
really
is.
upset me because nobody ever told me that in 2 years. I see about
Yeah.
the exercise all the time, but nobody before. And I had to look it up in a very weird way, like hands energy ball, expecting that it would give me back, I don't know, energy bars or something. But no, the first result was a Tai Chi blog. And I was like, why don't we say that? I would love to
Yeah.
understand more of the sources, because who knows what you left behind in the way that you thought this is enough, and then instead it would mean more for me. So yes, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and like the fourfold breath is another example, right?
Oh
That's
yeah,
from
the only
yeah.
person that told me that was Ariana in Spellcraft and Spellwork. She was
Oh
the
yeah, it's
first
in her
one.
book, isn't it? Yeah, I was
Yes, it's
like,
the first person that tells me square breath actually is this form of
yep,
pranayama yoga. And I was like,
yep.
I had no idea. We call it elemental breath, we call it square breath. It actually is where it comes from. And you know what? I appreciate that. I guess especially in the early 1900s, there was this Orientalism, and by all means, neither yoga nor Tai Chi are closed practices. But I feel
Right.
that something gets lost when we don't even say, but that's where we got the inspiration from.
Well, and the importance of finding a mentor. Like, I understand that it is really hard to find. I get it. Like, I have also had that struggle. But like, really, within a particular tradition, if you want to learn, like, you need to find a mentor. I mean, I've studied Golden Dawn material, but I will never say that I'm even though I like technically self-initiated into the Golden Dawn, I'm not an initiate because didn't have a mentor who like walked me through and like actually initiated me. I know a lot. I know a lot of the rituals and I use them sometimes, but like I'm not a true initiate. I arguably I would say, you know, I don't really have the fullest understanding of the Golden Dawn because I didn't have a mentor when I learned all these things. And I think that's true for a variety of different, you know, traditions. Like if you really want to learn in especially like initiatory traditions, you know, people will often do things and like self-initiate themselves. And I'm like, you miss so much when you do that without a mentor. It's really critical to have somebody who's been in the tradition for years, who knows kind of all the unspoken secrets, right? I mean, not everything is written down. And there is such an importance on mentorship. And I think it's really hard for people because authority has like such a negative connotation nowadays. But it can be really helpful to have somebody who has that authority who can teach you. And it's not a bad thing. And like, of course, there's like safeguards involved, like vet your mentors. Don't just accept what people say. You know, do your research. Like all those things are important when you do that. But like I cannot stress enough the importance of having a mentor to like tell you those things, right? That you may not know and or bring to light misconceptions that you have. Every good magician that I know has both like witchy contacts and academic contacts because you need to have both. You need to have the historical understanding and the academic understanding, which actually isn't always correct, right? Like sometimes the academics oversimplify things when like as a practitioner you would say, okay, actually, you know, I see maybe this can be divided into 6 categories when you just divide it into 4 because there's a couple of like magical nuances that you understand when you practice. And so really like that cross correspondence between the academic world and the magical world is really important because it gives you a much more holistic understanding of everything in its entirety. So yeah, I would just, for new people, you know, I think even for experienced practitioners, like gatekeeping is not the way to bolster the younger community into becoming good magicians. Like that's what we want. No one benefits from having a community of people who can't actually do effective magic. Like no one benefits from that. And so it's to our benefit, it's to the community's benefit, it's to the world's benefit to have people who are capable of really good magic. And so I think it's really important for us to build everybody up. And that includes, sharing things like spells when you have them. And I'm not saying to ignore the spirit contracts when they tell you can't, but I think people overuse that excuse, especially with things where it's like, that's super simple. Like, why wouldn't you be able to share that? And so it's like, share these things and walk with people and help them develop their works. Like, people often come, in servers with problems, and it's like, well, let's walk through it together. Like, what do you have on hand? Like, what are you willing to do? Because I'm willing to do a lot of things that a lot of other people aren't willing to do just because of the nature of my ceremonial practice. There are other people who are like, I can't do anything except, I have a spell and I have water. And I'm like, cool, we can do stuff with that. Like, this is how to go about it. And so, sharing that information is really helpful. Sharing kind of the history of where practices came from is good. And encouraging people to read these difficult texts and reading it alongside them. The whole reason I started the Agrippa Book Club in Hearth was because I knew from my own first reading of Agrippa that it was fucking hard to understand. Like, it is written in Old English. The Purdue version is a little bit more accessible in terms of like the language being used, but it's still hard. And there's a lot of like unspoken things that Agrippa is referencing that he doesn't explicitly say. And so to have somebody who says, yeah, like when he says this, he's actually referring to this. To have somebody to guide you through that could be super helpful. I had somebody help like do it with me. And so I feel like in order to help newer practitioners understand the theory, like they need to have somebody to help walk them through it. It's like, that's why I started it in the first place. I'm not paid to do it. I do it in my own time. It's like, it's fun. We have fun, but it's really important to help people understand kind of where they're pulling from, and that help them understand, Aristotle and Plato and like Neoplatonism and its differences, and Paracelsus and alchemy and Pythagorus. Like, all of these things are so critical to magic, and you have to understand that, and it's hard to do by yourself. And so finding communities that will bolster you and teach you these things can be really useful. It's a very long-winded answer to your very simple question.
No, it makes complete sense, because I was definitely gonna like end on the point that I hope it doesn't put any pressure on you, but know that of all the people that I consider have mentored me in those last 2 years, you're definitely one of them. There are things that I wouldn't have known where to start, and they were important to me. And it's because of your generosity that I managed to like put myself more in a clear direction. And genuinely, the reason why now the most interesting part for me to want to dig onto is ceremonial and Solomonic magic, specifically with the pentacles. Which is why at the beginning I was like, oh yeah, everybody talks about the lesser key, but I'm somewhat more interested in the key. So I'm glad to see that makes sense.
You should give yourself credit for your magic too. Like, I only give people inspiration. Like, you're the one who has to make it come into fruition. So by all means, like take all the praise for making your own magic works. Don't give it to me.
Well, when I didn't know where everything was, like everything in front of me, so I have no idea where to go, where to pick, and where to ask. You definitely put me in a good direction, and I don't think there's anything that I've done based on stuff that you have suggested that hasn't worked, which speaks for itself, really.
Oh, that's very sweet. Thank you.
Right, Astrid, thank you so much for spending like almost 2 hours of your Sunday with me. I really, really appreciate it. And I really hope that if people watching this have curiosity and questions, respectfully, they feel free to leave them in the comments, and maybe you'll take a look and you can reply to that. Thank you again. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, of course. Please, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on. It was very kind of you to ask in the first place, and I really appreciate that you kind of came into it with the perspective of like wanting to understand. I respect that a lot about you. So yeah, just thank you for holding the space, and I hope it proves useful to people.
Not at all. Thank you so much for how, again, it's always your way of doing things is always marked by a kindness and generosity that I wish I saw more often. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, of course. No problem.